So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming in Geneva. It's in our second headquarters. For those who know us, it's very nice to see your continuing interest in IATA. For those who are new, welcome, and we hope it's the first time of a long series of venue in our Global Media Day. So for those who are not informed about IATA, we are the trade association for the world's airline. We have 290, almost 300 members, and we represent 82% of the traffic. We have three activities in IATA, as you know: advocacy, global standards, and we provide our members and our customers with products and services to enhance, to improve their activities. As you will see, IATA is involved in many aspects of the business: regulatory, product, services, data product, IT. And I don't need to remind you that our business is intensely competitive. It's a competitive industry, and passengers and shippers are benefiting greatly from this competition. This year we have transported over 4.5 billion passengers, 61 million tons of freight, and all of that will travel through more than 22,000 unique city pairs that are connected by air. This number is the double of routes that were available in 1998. And you know, of course, that the average return fare in 2019, before surcharges and tax, is forecast to be 62% lower than in 1998. So the double of routes and 62% are cheaper when you exclude tax and surcharges. What it means is that we are not anymore a business for the wealthy people. It means that young people in emerging countries are exposed to travel opportunities that even their parents could only have dreamed of at the same age. And this opens a world of possibilities to experience other places, cultures, to learn, to find employment, to make global connections, to do business. What it means basically is that we are a strong contributor to one of our fundamental freedom, the freedom to go back and forth, la liberté d'aller et venir, we say in French. It's a basic one. When you think about that, it is the first one you are deprived when you are punished. The first one. So we are the contributor to one of the fundamental freedom. So flying is freedom. We are the business of freedom. It's not by chance. It's a reality every day. And that freedom grows prosperity. It changes people's lives for the better. And so we are proud to contribute to that. But we see also some forces that in this world that are working against that freedom. IATA has and will continue to take a strong stance that we are better off with borders that are open to people and to trade. Trade wars produce no winners. And while respecting the right of countries to protect their borders, we believe that greater connectivity makes our world a better place. It is part of the DNA of an industry with a mission to bring people closer as a global community. On 7 December, we marked 75 years since the signing of the Chicago Convention, which sets the basic framework for civil aviation. Even as the Second World War raged, the signatories of the Chicago Convention understood the unique role of aviation. When you think about their vision in December 1944, where Europe was still destroyed by war, Pacific was destroyed by war, all the world was totally in disruption. These people who met in Chicago to forecast, to plan, to build the structure of the Chicago Convention, frankly, they were visionaries when you think about it. For me, it's always something that triggers my my fascination. I'm fascinated to see how people were visionary in December 1944 to build the future of aviation, to build the future of freedom. And what they said, they noted that its development can greatly help to create and preserve friendship and understanding among the nations and peoples of the world. You're saying a sentence like that in December 1944, you must look, you had to look forward. Huh? Cleverly. A few months later, on the 19th of April 1945, the airlines of the world came together in Cuba with a similar vision, and we created IATA. So for 75 years, we have tried, and quite successfully, to represent and serve the airline industry, grouping the majority of the major airlines around our table. In 1945, just to give you the numbers, 9 million people traveled by air. Today we transport the same number, 9 million, on average every 18 hours. Significant change. And together, of course, with the International Civil Aviation Organization, with ICAO, we have made flying a key element of our modern life. Flying's vital role is recognized in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We play a part in achieving 15 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So it means that this industry is fundamentally relevant to addressing humankind's toughest challenges. But as many human activity, we have an environmental impact. Aircraft burn fuel, and that releases carbon. And we know that we represent 2% of global man-made carbon emissions. But even if 2% is not an enormous number, we feel responsible for reducing that carbon footprint. And as all industry, but perhaps ahead of the others, we need to step up, and we need to make serious climate action commitments. And we did it in 2008. Long before, almost more than 10 years, 12 years or 11 years, before the word Flixskam, sorry for my bad Swedish accent, entered our vocabulary. You remember, we made 3 commitments. First of all, we committed to improve fuel efficiency by 1.5% between 2010 and 2020. You must know that we have achieved 2.3%. So we are much above our target. Second commitment, we committed to carbon neutral growth from 2020. And we successfully convinced 193 states to adopt the CORSIA program, so a worldwide program applicable all over the world to compensate our carbon emissions. This compensation program will enable us to cap net emissions, but it will also generate $40 billion in climate funding over the lifetime of the scheme, $40 billion in climate funding. And the third commitment we made was to cut our emissions to half 2005 levels by 2050. So aligning aviation with the Paris Agreement. As you know, we are collaborating through an industry group, the Air Transport Action Group, ATAG, to map out how we will achieve this on realistic technology and policy solutions. We think that we will make it. Scientifically and technically, we have the scientific and technical means to make it in 2050. But you must be aware, and you are conscious of the ambitious goal that cutting our emissions by 2 compared to 2005 level, how ambitious it is. Because it means that we will have to reduce by 90%, the emission per passenger, and that we will have to cut our global emissions by 3 compared to the current level. Now we emit something like 900 million tons. We'll have to move to 350 million tons. So it's roughly something like a division by 3, which is not a small or minimal target. It's an ambitious one. But you know that we are a serious industry. We do things that we have committed to. And we will make it. But we have to work, a lot of work. We have to make sure that CORSIA is successful, the carbon offsetting program is successful, and that it will not be compromised by a patchwork of competing tax and charges. And we are strongly advocating, particularly in Europe, to avoid all these national systems that are piling up to have a so-called influence on environment. They have a real influence on budget and taxes. I'm not sure that they have any influence on environment compared to what CORSIA will have. Secondly, we must convince government to help us, the whole industry, to help us to focus on driving the technology and policy solutions that will make flying sustainable. Immediately, we have to convince them to help us to develop the biofuels or the sustainable alternative fuels. First in production, and secondly in distribution. Because as you know, they have the potential to cut our carbon footprint by up to 80%. So it's a major contributor to the reduction of our carbon footprint. So we are pushing hard the government to help us to develop this biofuel industry, trying also to associate the oil-producing companies, energy companies to contribute. And finally, we need to support these efforts with effective communication so that people and governments are fully aware of what aviation is doing. Perhaps on that point, we have been too shy, or perhaps too arrogant, I don't know. We have communicated among ourselves within the circle of aviation, and we have neglected to communicate outside of aviation, to talk to the public opinion, to talk to decision makers, to influencers, and to tell them what we do. What you must be aware of, and you are perfectly aware of it, is that the bad news is that we haven't communicated enough, but we will do it. The good news is that we have a good story. We have a convincing story. And believe me, I do that every day, everywhere in the world, to all kinds of decision makers, of influencers, of people. And frankly, they are convinced, but they don't know. But when they know, they are convinced. That's the good news. So, just to be very, very clear, the enemy is not flying. What we have to convince people is it's possible to fly without polluting or while reducing our carbon footprint. It's possible, and we will fly probably 4 times the number of people we fly today in 2050, and we will divide our carbon emission by 3. So it is possible, and we have to convince people that the enemy is not flying, the enemy is carbon, and that they will be able to fly proudly, comfortably, without emitting too much CO2. It's what we are going to expose in these global media days. We will expose all the environment policy. We are putting together the measures we are recommending. You must know that we will also try to do our best to make this global media day a carbon neutral event. So even you are going to participate in reducing or limiting, capping carbon emission. We will also present a lot of other subjects on which we are working, all the subjects on which we are working. We expect your questions, we expect your remarks, and all the agenda will be presented by Tony. So please participate, ask your questions. We are there to inform you, to complete your information, to have your feedback, and to welcome you in IATA, to convince you that we are doing something for the good of everyone. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. Just on the carbon neutral event comment, we're working with my Climate Care, I should say, with 3 specific projects. One is called LifeStraw, which helps with drinking water in Kenya and saves about 2.4 million tons of carbon each year there. We're also working with IATA, which is a Ghana project to try and have better cooking stoves in that country, and that has saved about 3 million tons of CO2 to date. And we're also working with Kisagao, which is helping to preserve 500,000 acres of Kenyan forest. So we've calculated what we believe is the environmental cost of this meeting, and we'll be offsetting that with these 3 projects via Climate Care. You'll notice in the handout that there's a lot more commentary that follows through the program over the next 2 days. That commentary is open for reporting, but we thought, given the large number of people in the room, that we would move very quickly into the outlook and allow a lot of time for questions so that we can answer as many as we possibly can. I would just point out that over the next 2 days, we will cover pretty much all of IATA's priorities. So you'll see our involvement in safety and security this morning, and we have 2 of our senior vice presidents responsible for that. Gilberto Lopez-Meyer, who's our head of safety and flight operations, as well as Nick Perrine, who's in charge of airports, passenger, cargo, and security. In the afternoon, we'll look more at IATA's involvement in passenger issues. So we'll be discussing some of the exciting work we're doing with passengers with disabilities. We'll talk a little bit about our future for the industry with an exciting program called Next, sort of reimagining the future of travel, and the various projects that brings together into one key vision. We'll also be talking about some important work that we're doing with the industry to help gender diversity. And so there's a pledge that we've engaged the industry with, and it's been very popular since we announced it in late September. So we'll be reporting on progress on that. And we'll also talk about and close the day with a session on slots, which is one of the key issues for the industry. There isn't sufficient airport infrastructure in this world, and so we need a system in order to use the infrastructure that we have in the most efficient way possible. And we'll have our head of that program presenting some of the key challenges that we face with respect to slots. Tomorrow, as Alexandre mentioned, we'll be going through a full morning on aviation and the environment. And I think the key message for that is IATA is doing a lot, but this is an industry effort. And so tomorrow morning, you'll see not just a whole bunch of IATA speakers, but you'll actually see some speakers from the industry, from our friends at Airbus and Rolls-Royce, from Skyguide, which is a Swiss air navigation service provider, and the Catering Association, also talking about how we're all working together to help drive forward the environment agenda. So I hope you'll find that to be a very interesting morning session. And then in the afternoon, we take a deep dive into cargo. And we've got all of our cargo experts on deck, and they'll be presenting some of the key projects and issues that we face in that part of the industry, which, as I'm sure when Brian goes through his outlook, will explain, is going through some very tough times at this point in time. So with that, I will hope that you will join us and stay with us for the next 2 days. And I'll turn it back to Alexandre to give us a few sort of high-level thoughts in advance of the outlook.
So I know that you have come not to listen to me, of course, but to listen to Brian, because he is providing you with the outlook. Everybody is expecting that. And especially, you could be surprised by the outlook, as I have been. You know the global figures. We are supporting 2.7 trillion US dollars of economic activity. It's something like 3.6% of global GDP. You know that this industry has not always been profitable. Profitability has always been a challenge, but it is less of a challenge now. It has been less of a challenge now for something like 10 years. We are slightly better in this area. There are some uncertainties. There are also opportunities. We are overexposed to many risks, but we see also we have the major chance to have a growing business in front of us on the long run. So giving the floor to Brian. He will explain that into details. Thank you, Brian. You have the floor. You are highly expected.
Just as Brian is getting ready, just one more reminder on the embargo, just so that it's fair for everyone in the room. 10:30 before anything goes out of this room, and I'll make an announcement when we get to 10:30. So with that, Brian.
Thank you very much, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think, as Alexandre has already said, the industry has found 2019 to be much tougher than we were expecting just 6 months ago in June. And I think that's really been driven by the severity of the impact of the trade wars that has had on both the cargo business, but then more broadly on weakening business confidence and thereby affecting the industry more broadly. So we've downgraded our forecast for 2019 pretty much across the board in terms of the growth of demand, which has turned out to be weaker than we had expected, and also airline profitability has been weaker than we were expecting. As we look into 2020 and the factors that we think will shape the outlook, we do see some scope for stability, for a more stable 2020 than we've certainly had this year. But let me start by looking back. Let me start by looking at the top 10 passenger markets and at the growth that we've seen in the year to date. And as you can see, the industry has faced a huge variety in terms of the strength of growth of air travel demand, ranging from the strongest growth in the domestic Chinese market, where we've seen growth of 8.5%. So the Chinese still want to travel despite the slowdown in the economy. Down to across the Pacific, we've seen actually less than 2% growth, and I think that's a reflection of the indirect impacts of the trade war that has actually started to be affecting air travel as well as the cargo business. You might be surprised to see travel within Europe as the second fastest growth. Actually, if you look in detail at that is driven entirely by growth in the Eastern European economies and markets. Those emerging or transition economies are where the expansion is taking place. In Western Europe, where indeed all the climate concerns are, we're actually seeing growth of less than 3%. The overall picture is one of slowdown. Indeed, for the cargo business, it's of shrinkage in volumes in 2019. As you can see, and as often happens in the air transport industry, it's cargo that is the leading indicator. And we saw cargo volumes weakening really sharply at the end of last year. And as you can see, it's been a pretty miserable year for the cargo business. And we reckon now that we're going to see freight ton kilometres on average 3.3% lower this year than in 2018. And that is the worst performance of demand for air cargo services since the global financial crisis. And it's pretty clear that has been driven mostly by the impact of the tariff wars, the trade wars, and the effect that has had. As you can see, that has started to damage air travel as well, through weakening business confidence and more broadly slowing GDP growth down. So we've had to downgrade our expectations for passenger growth. We now think that we're going to see something like 4.2% growth. We had been expecting 5% growth, so actually that's below trend. So 2019, a tough year. But throughout that, airlines have actually been growing the number of cities they've been connecting. And in terms of the cost to users in real terms, so after adjusting for inflation, that continues to fall. And this is our key value proposition, not just to customers, not just to business and household users. Obviously, that's offering more choice at lower price, but to the world economy as well. The modern world economy depends a lot on efficient connections between cities. That is how trade flows, that is how investment flows. half of world trade today is in components. And that's because we've got supply chains around the world that depend on efficient air transport services. And this is how air transport is contributing to economic development, particularly for those developing and emerging markets and economies. And this next year, we expect to see those connections rise above 23,000 for the first time. And the cost of air transport for users, both businesses as well as people, down in real terms by more than 2%. So a strong contribution from those city pair connections. Not all regions are as equally well connected. And if we look at connectivity compared to the size of the population of the region, it's pretty clear that North America is extremely well connected. Europe and the Middle East also pretty well connected too. But if we're looking to air transport's contribution to economic development and the broader economy, the high growth regions of Asia, Latin America and Africa are clearly way behind in terms of the city pair connections along which trade and investment will flow. There is more that the industry needs to do to support the economic development of much of the world. It's not just the support to the economy. What we've seen happening over the last few years in the airline business is also supporting the profitability of the rest of the value chain, suppliers to the air transport industry. Now we know that airlines have actually improved their profitability. The red bars here show return on capital over the last 10 years since the global financial crisis. So you can see the improvement that there's been in financial performance in the airline sector, giving much better returns to their investors. It's also clear that this has not been at the expense of suppliers. In fact, airlines and their users have pulled up the profitability of the rest of the supply chain as well. Airports, MRO, ground handling. There are actually two sectors where that's not been true. We've seen the profitability of the GDSs, the Amadeus, the sailors, and the OEMs, the manufacturers, decline from where it was before the global financial crisis. But as you can see, they're earning returns for their investors of more than 20%. That's not a bad performance. And I think the other conclusion from this chart is that despite the improvements in the financial performance of the airline sector in the last 10 years, that value chain still looks pretty unbalanced. But let me look at the performance of airlines over those 10 years. And this shows the operating margin on average in the industry. The red line strips out the seasonal ups and downs. And it's a story of improvement since the global financial crisis. It's clear that there was a peak in that improvement around about 2016. And so the messages, the stories that you've heard from us over the last couple of years is one of where profitability has been squeezed by the business environment. I think, though, that we are seeing signs of some stabilization in that more recent downward trend. And although 2019 has actually turned out to be disappointing, we had expected to see a better performance, and that driven by the pressures from the trade wars, that's actually depressed profitability. Well, that mostly took place at the back end of 2018. In 2019, we've actually seen the start of some stabilization, I think, in the profitability of the airline industry on average. And we would expect to see that stability, given what the expectations are for economic growth and oil prices. We would expect to see that stability extend into 2020. One of the challenges, though, that we have is that actually the performance is still relatively fragile. If we look at the number of airlines that have actually driven the improvement that we've seen over the last 10 years, it's actually been relatively small. If we rank airlines by their profits, you can actually see that the improvement that we've seen in the last 10 years has been driven by 20 or 30 airlines. Now there's a long tail of airlines that are still just about breaking even, and they haven't really seen any improvement in the last 10 years. And indeed, of course, we've got some airlines in the industry that are still suffering from substantial losses. Now this is the reason why, that despite the relatively good financial performance measures that we've been talking about at an aggregate industry level, we've seen a series of bankruptcies here in Europe over the last couple of years. And that's because of this, that long tail of airlines that actually haven't been able to see that improvement over the last 10 years. And the same is true if we look at the balance sheet position of the industry. We've seen actually quite remarkable improvements in debt metrics for the airlines that have really driven that improvement over the last 10 years. So the top 30 of those airlines have actually reduced the debt to earnings ratios almost to investment grade levels. And that gives a lot of resilience to those airlines if we're hit by a shock. And of course we had earlier been fearing a recession. I think those fears have diminished. But clearly, those airlines are in a much more stable, sustainable position. But actually, much of the industry hasn't seen an improvement. In fact, much of the industry has still got debt of something like 6 times earnings. That means we've still got some fragility, vulnerability in the industry to any sort of cash flow shock or higher interest rates that comes along. And I think the good news for us is that the likelihood of the recession that we had feared, the bond market in the US was predicting, seems to have diminished. And this chart here shows the forecasts by the IMF of global GDP growth. It shows successive forecasts. I mean, it does, I suppose one takeaway from this is don't believe forecasters, they get it wrong. And it also shows that prospects for 2019 have been downgraded significantly over the last 18 months. And that's one of the reasons, it's because of trade wars. And that's the reason why we've downgraded our prospects, our expectations for the industry. But actually, looking at 2020, there's some optimism amongst actually most of the mainstream economic forecasters. So 2020, he's certainly not going to see, well, not certainly, I should never say certainly, but the expectation is that there won't be a recession. In fact, growth might be slightly better in 2020. That's typically good news for the air transport sector, both in terms of growth and also in terms of profitability. I should say that this expectation is contingent on there being a truce in the trade war. Now, we're not expecting to see tariffs reduced, but what we have made our forecast based on is no further increase of tariffs. And obviously, we've got a date coming up on the 15th, where there are some further tariffs threatened on China by the US. We're really basing our forecast on the expectation that we'll see those either downgraded or postponed. I think the phase 1 of the trade negotiations seems to us to be progressing, which gives us some hope that we will see a more stable situation in the trade arena in the run-up, obviously, to the US elections later next year. If that is the case, the IMF expect to see some rebound in world trade growth. I mean, not very strong, just over 3%, but that should bring some respite to the air cargo sector if that happens. One of the other challenges that we've got is that once the Boeing 737 MAX returns to service in 2020, there's a big backlog of aircraft that are expected to be delivered in 2020. And if all goes to the manufacturer's plans, that could mean quite a surge of new aircraft arriving, representing something like 7.5% of the fleet. Clearly, if that happened, that's a lot of new capacity to swallow. We don't expect that to have a one-for-one impact on capacity. We suspect that there will be some rescheduling of some of these deliveries. There are clearly some production issues in the aerospace sector as well, which are likely to slow down. And of course, it also depends on retirements, on the extent to which these new aircraft replace existing fleet. And we actually think that we'll see an increase in retirements because airlines have been extending lives of aircraft because of the shortages, and they want to get more fuel efficient and cost-effective aircraft in the fleet. And I think in Europe, there's also another factor that's likely to encourage retirements, and that's the climate issue. I mean, you've already heard that the industry has been focused on addressing the climate issue for more than a decade now. We've got a session on that tomorrow. It hasn't been on the priority list of mainstream investors until now. And this chart here shows the number of times climate change has come up in earnings calls with investors and airlines. And you can see the spike in Europe this year. This is a mainstream investor issue now. And as I say, I think that's going to be another factor which will encourage early retirements. And so we actually think that the supply-demand situation in Europe is going to be reasonably positive. And that's why we're actually expecting European airlines to do relatively better in 2020 than the tough year they've had this year. So let me just sum up all of those factors and the sort of the main parts to our forecast. So firstly, demand. Clearly, air travel volume growth has dipped down. We had previously, until this year, seen several years of above-trend growth, really rapid air travel growth. That dipped this year. We think that with a slightly better economic growth forecast, we're likely to see similar-ish growth, something like 4.1% growth in RPKs. Cargo volumes had been shrinking this year. We expect them to see a moderate rebound along with world trade in 2020. So clearly 2020 is still below trend, but better than 2019. In terms of the major costs to airlines, fuel, there are two factors here. One is that, as you can see from the existing futures curve, the expectation amongst the markets is that oil prices are going to stay relatively low over the next year. And if we look at fundamentals, there's a lot of oil supply out there, particularly outside of OPEC. And if we look at the inventories of oil, they're at relative highs at the moment. So I think there's some good fundamentals behind that expectation that oil prices will stay relatively low. We had been worried that jet fuel prices would rise relative to oil prices because of the pressure from the shipping industry buying diesel and other low sulfur fuels from the middle part of the barrel of oil. And actually what seems to be happening is that that's not happening to the extent that we were expecting. So low fuel costs, I think another positive supporting the outlook for 2020. And then this sort of sums up the aggregate industry profitability numbers. As you can see, we have had a bit of a squeeze in the last few years, but we're expecting this year, I would describe that as stability after the squeeze on profitability in the last few years. The operating margin on average we think will go from just over 5% this year to 5.5%. We'd expect to see in terms of the billions of dollars, something just below 26 billion this year, something a bit above 29 billion in 2020. given the uncertainties, that is broad stability. And if we compare that to the past, that doesn't look a bad performance for the industry. And it's not. However, that doesn't mean to say we're still not facing a challenge to get a sustainable, a financially sustainable industry across the board. And if we look at the return on capital by main region compared to the dotted line there, which shows the industry average cost of capital, which is essentially what investors expect to earn when they invest their money in airlines. You can see North America and Europe, we expect to continue to do pretty well, continue to generate value for investors. But actually outside those two regions, and remember the earlier slides, outside the relatively small number of airlines, airlines are still unable to produce the sort of profitability or generate the returns that investors would expect. So we've still got a job to do to spread that financial sustainability across the industry as a whole. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. So with that, one reminder that we're still under embargo, and we'll open it up to questions. Who'd like to ask the first question? Karen?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Brian. A couple of quick questions. First, can you just give me, from an economist's point of view, explain what seems like a positive, why you're positive for 2020 economy? And you said that. You mentioned the the build-up to the US elections and stuff like that, but I can't see what that tie-up is. And then is IATA anticipating more bankruptcies among airlines on the same sort of level that we've seen in the past 2 years?
Yeah, okay. Two good questions. So on the broader economy, I mean, we do take our guidance from the mainstream institutions of the IMF. The tie-up with the US election is that trade wars are typically hurting US consumers. And I think it's clearly very difficult to say for sure what will happen. But logic to us dictates, and I think that's the assumption of most of the mainstream, that we'll see a continuing truce on that front. Not least because China seems to be giving some ground in terms of the phase one requests from the US. More broadly, though, we expect to see growth being supported by what the central banks are doing. We've actually seen the central banks change from tightening up their pumping of money. I mean, they were pulling money back out of the economy, they're now pumping it back in, both the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. And fiscal policy, while not particularly strong, certainly we've seen the end of austerity, and in the US it's not quite as supportive, but in other places it is. So there is some support for growth in 2020. In terms of bankruptcies, we hope not. And I think the slightly better growth situation in 2020 and relatively low fuel prices may help. But as you saw, there's a long tail of airlines where the situation is pretty fragile. So we certainly can't rule out more difficulties, because this year is certainly not going to be very strong business environment.
Maybe we'll go to the very back of the room. So, Marissa?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I had a question particular to the trans-Pacific to US compared to Pacific to Europe. Has there been, you mentioned that there was a dip in the traffic going to the US, but has there been a corresponding increase in passengers coming to Europe from China?
To some extent, yes. I think one of the things that we have seen as a result of the trade dispute between the US and China is that production has certainly shifted to other parts of Asia, and so you've seen some compensating flows, but it hasn't completely offset that because we've seen overall world trade actually shrinking. And travel, there's certainly been a very sharp slowdown in the Trans-Pacific air travel market, whereas Europe to Asia is pretty strong. I don't think it's entirely because of the trade dispute, but there's no doubt an element of that.
We'll take another question. If I could ask you also to identify yourself and your publication in advance, that would be great. And I know there are a few non-working journalists in the room. We'll give priority to the working journalists in terms of questions, and then we'll come back to the end if we have some time, if that's all right. So we'll take a question on the right-hand side.
Hello, Robin Ironside from The Australian. I wanted to ask you, what impact do you think the 737 MAX grounding had on the worse than expected performance in 2019?
To be honest, I don't think it. I mean, clearly adversely affected a number of airlines. It was a relatively small number in the fleet as a whole, less than half percent. So I think really, the worse than expected results in 2019 were mostly driven by broader economic developments, the trade disputes in particular. But clearly, a number of airlines were unable to put on the services that they wanted to, so connectivity suffered because new routes would have been put in place by these longer range, narrow body aircraft. So I think consumers suffered as a result, businesses suffered as a result, they didn't get the direct service, and airlines have managed to bring aircraft out of storage or extend the lives of aircraft. Clearly they've been less efficient because the MAXes and modern aircraft like them typically deliver sort of 15 or 20% cost savings. So that would have been absent. So there was an element where that has damaged profitability.
Okay, other questions? Maybe here in the front.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm Ryan from the Jordan Times. You mentioned the US-China trade dispute as a major factor affecting both passenger and cargo growth. Would Brexit have the same consequences?
No. I think Brexit, we know from the recent past, is damaging particularly for the UK economy and to some extent for the continental European economy. I mean, we know that car manufacturers and others and people in the financial sector are shifting bases from the UK to Europe in anticipation that we will see Brexit. Obviously, we can't be sure of that. We've got an election coming up in the UK in the next week or so. I think the likelihood is that it will happen, but we don't know. Certainly, some of the parties in the UK have been calling for a second referendum. Surprises happen. I think the airlines have found workarounds to Brexit in terms of ownership control. I think regulators have been working hard. IATA have been working hard with those regulators to make sure connectivity remains in place. But clearly, there are going to be problems with the cargo sector. There'll be border checks. There'll be origin. There's a lot more paperwork, which we know is damaging. The UK economic growth, the size of the UK economy, is widely expected to be smaller if or when Brexit happens.
Thank you. We'll take one at the back on the left.
Thank you. I'm from People's Daily China. Several years ago, I have two questions. Several years ago, IATA industry outlook said the gravity of global aviation is shifting eastward. But for the last 2 years, there are a lot of uncertainties in the global market. So I want to know, such a trend is continuing or not? If continue, how's the speed? Is it fast or slowing down? My second question is, in the outlook released just now, you said domestic China market is the strongest area growth. So, in your opinion, what's the main driving force for such for making China to be the top one in growth? Thank you.
You're quite right. I mean, there's a chart that we often use, which in effect sort of balances travel markets on a pin, sees where the centre of gravity is, and that centre of gravity 10 years ago was over Western Europe, and that's quite important for the geographical advantages of hub airlines, which were in Western Europe. That centre of gravity has been shifting rapidly east, and is actually still shifting rapidly east, because that's where the strongest growth is. If you recall my first chart showing the variety of travel growth, Asia appeared in many of those fastest growing markets. That means that the bulk of those travel markets is shifting east. And that gives advantage for hub airlines. It also indicates where our infrastructure challenges and also environmental challenges are going to be in future years. So the answer to your first question, yeah, that's happening. It's not slowed down. If anything, it's probably speeded up because of the weakness in Europe recently. I think the driving force behind domestic Chinese growth is that although the Chinese economy has been slowing, I think that's been part of a rebalancing by the authorities away from an export-driven economy towards more of a demand-driven economy, which is actually positive for domestic aviation growth. It means that consumers and households have strong income growth. We're seeing Chinese airlines put on very substantial increases in services. We still see the average frequency of travel of Chinese people at a much lower level than it is in Western Europe or in North America. So I think there's still a long way to go. We still see that market as a key driver of future growth in the aviation industry.
Great. Thank you, Brian. We'll take a question from Andreas.
I'm wondering, you just mentioned, can you hear me? You mentioned how the flight shaming debate will probably spur innovation of the airlines to fleet renewal. But I wonder in terms of passenger forecast numbers, we have seen a drop in domestic, that's how it should work things. We've seen a drop in domestic Swedish traveling apparently, which might be attributed to this factor, to this discussion. But do you see already any other impact, or do you see in general the forecast impact? But so far, apparently, in the whole industry, numbers are still rising steeply rather than going down. So will that be having any economical impact, this debate about flight shaming? Thanks.
Yes, you're quite right. What we've seen in Sweden is quite a significant fall in passenger numbers. The question is, why is that? And we should recall that we had a tax imposed on air travel in Sweden in 2018. We also saw weakness in currencies in the region, which reduced the purchasing power of outbound Swedish travellers. We saw relative weakness in the economy. We did do some work, and we found it very difficult to detect a flying shame, a fleet scam effect on that. It seemed to be mostly driven by the increased cost of travel due to the tax. But I mean, certainly the industry is taking this consumer sentiment very seriously, but I think that as you'll hear tomorrow, there's there's an issue about understanding what the industry, what is being done about this. Now, Alexandre talked about separating the flying, which is a good activity, both in terms of consumer choice, but also in terms of supporting global economies, and carbon, which is the thing that we need to decarbonise to get rid of.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Tim?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. Tim Heath from Reuters. Thank you, Brian. You mentioned currencies briefly there. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the impact of currencies on airline profits, especially in some of these areas with weaker currencies and high dollar costs. And secondly, on Europe, back to European consolidation. Many people make an argument that there are still just too many airlines in Europe. Do you think that there is scope for significant further consolidation just on pure economic grounds, forgetting questions of national loyalties and so forth? Are there too many airlines in Europe? Could we expect to see that corrected? Thank you.
Yeah, exchange rates are really important. We've been through a period of dollar strength, and that's very good for airlines where their home currency is the US dollar. But because many of the big costs for airlines, fuel and aircraft, are priced in dollars. If you have a weak currency against the US dollar, that raises your costs. And we've certainly seen that troubling airlines in Latin America, and that's often a problem in Africa as well. So yeah, that's a challenge. Yeah, and as Alexandre says, in India as well. I mean, at the moment, markets, you talked about European consolidation. I mean, actually what we've seen is that a series of bankruptcies of airlines in Europe, that still hasn't really affected the level of competition. If you look at the number of routes that are flown by more than three or more airlines, that proportion has actually risen over the last few years. So in terms of consumers, they're still getting an exceptionally good deal. But Europe and Asia and Africa are still highly fragmented markets. And I think in many industries you would expect to see much more consolidation than has taken place in air transport. We know that the regulatory framework makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to see cross-border consolidation. There are a lot of airlines, but I would say that we think it's really up to the market to decide what the appropriate number of airlines is. We would think that there's clearly scope for more consolidation, though, given that long tail of airlines that haven't been performing or haven't improved over the last 10 years.
Okay. Question here?
And from Hungary, so I have a question to Mr. Juniac. So Wizz Air, which is not an IATA, they shamed the full service carriers because of business class. So they say that business class, the shame, it has to be eliminated in the European routes, which are less than 5 hours. So what is the take of IATA on that?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's what is our opinion on airlines like Wizz Air, which are calling for the elimination of business class?
It's up to the airline to have the appropriate marketing approach for the customer. So we have no comments to do on that. It's purely a strategic and commercial decision from the airline. And you think slightly further, having someone who is not doing business class asking for the others not to do it. Small bias, perhaps.
And I think one other comment we could make is the overall approach of the industry to environment is similar to the approach on safety. You know, we have common industry targets, we have common industry goals. We are working together. So, you know, I think as an industry, if we're going to be successful in this, we need to focus on the targets, on some of these publicity stunts. Question here, and then Dina. So, yeah, first question.
This is Andreas Space Travel. It concerns the growing taxes, tariffs, burdens, especially on European carriers. And do you see especially carriers in the US and Far Eastern airlines which are not currently faced with these kind of burdens, a growing imbalance in competition?
It's a clear concern from the European part to see an imbalance between them and the rest of the world, because they will be overcharged with taxes. That's for sure, it's a European concern. Viewed from the other part of the world, Asia or US, on that point, we see a growing concern in the US about the potential environment policy that could be implemented not only in Europe but also in North America. So the concern is spreading all over the world. But there is a clear imbalance viewed from the European side.
Dina?
Hi, Dina Kamen from the National Newspaper in Abu Dhabi. Quick question for Brian. Regarding the Middle East carriers, you were expecting somewhat of a rebound in 2020, and I'm curious about the factors behind that, given that you indicated some relatively low oil prices continuing into next year. What do you think is going to fuel that rebound in 2020? And also, could you say what oil price the forecast has been based on?
Sure, yes. So in terms of the oil price, we based it on an average of $63 a barrel for Brent crude. And that means something like $75, $76 a barrel for jet fuel on average. The Middle East, it's obviously gone through a very difficult time. There have been lots of local difficulties, as well as the general slowdown in trade and travel. But if you look at certainly what the IMF and others are saying about the regional economy, it's actually looking in much better shape in 2020. There's quite a rebound. I think the Middle East grew by, on average, 0.2% this year. Really weak, reflecting partly the weakness of fuel prices, but that is expected to rebound to 2% in 2020. But it's also an issue of self-help by the airlines. There's a lot of restructuring that has been going on, particularly in the Gulf, and we would expect, we're already starting to see that improving earnings, and we expect that to continue. I mean, we are still expecting losses to continue in the region, but at a much lower rate.
Yeah, Kurt?
Yes, hi, morning, Kurt from Air Transport World. In Berlin, you told us, or Kassensport told us that compensate for the CO2 on tickets is just 0.01% of all passengers compensate for their flights. So what do you think airlines should make this more attractive, or have IATA ideas that people are more willing to do it? And I can imagine, I was in Moscow recently, no one takes care about flight shaming or things like that. So what do you think, if this increase more?
As you know, it's a bit disappointing to see that we are proposing a system to compensate with the carbon emission for individual flights, and that it has very little success. We should continue, and it will probably, we will see more and more companies proposing whatever mechanism to compensate your carbon emission. But we must be realistic. People are talking, but they are not acting as they talk. human nature, I'm sorry. But it will not prevent us from continuing to propose similar mechanisms.
And remember, of course, that from next year, the government mechanism of CORSIA comes into place. So airlines themselves will be compensating, will be offsetting growth as we go forward.
Thank you. Danny?
Danny, the Sunshine Morning Post. You raised some concerns about the way the centre of travel is shifting east. Correct me if I'm wrong here, how do you go about asking airlines in Asia, some of the fastest growing in the world, with the ambitions to be some of the biggest in the world, like Chinese carriers, to maybe cut their growth to be more responsible when it comes to growing and obviously in relation to carbon emissions? And secondly, a more local question, how do you feel about Hong Kong and the airlines? Are they still getting a raw deal on airport charges? Do you think the authorities are dragging their feet too much in response to the protest impact?
I'll take the first question. I mean, I think you know we're an industry that's responsive to the demands of businesses and consumers that want to use us. I think that I think it would be a mistake to stop Chinese airlines or Indian airlines from growing because they will need to connect the cities to enable the trade and investment to raise living standards and to support their economies. What we need to do is to decouple those city connections, which are positive, from the carbon that's emitted. And as I say, we'll hear a lot more about that tomorrow. But the offsetting scheme in CORSIA is one step. Another is the development of sustainable fuels. So it's that decoupling that's critical to resolve this issue, I think.
And regarding what the Hong Kong authorities should do to improve traffic or to help the operators, we are always in favor of reducing charges everywhere, because we think it has positive effects. So in Hong Kong particularly, but in many other places.
And we saw the effects of that when the Hong Kong government responded to SARS many, many years ago. So it should be a familiar request. We'll take a question in the front.
Thank you. I'm Cyril from Rwanda. We saw in the presentation, asking the question to Brian, that Africa and Latin America still have a long way to catch up when it comes to connectivity. And so, but in particularly on Africa, what does IATA have another advice to give to African operators on top of the proposed SATAM? What do you tell to new African members when they join the association in terms of like boosting the connectivity? What advice, any other advice do you give to them?
Well, I mean, I do think that the proposed single air transport market in Africa is a key development that will help connectivity. I mean, as you saw from the chart, connectivity by air is really poor in Africa. And because of the nature of the continent, it's critical to have good air connections, particularly east to west. And so air transport can play a major role, I think, in improving economies and development. And so a lot of the problems have been the restrictions that governments have placed on services. And so having a single aviation market, I think, would be a huge step forward, and we would certainly support that. But of course, that's not the only thing that needs to happen. You need to have investment in capacity, and IATA is very involved in sort of developing safety oversight capacity in governments, and also efficiencies in airlines. I mean, one of the features that we do see in many markets in Africa is that infrastructure is inadequate, and it's a very expensive place to do business as well.
The advice we provide to new members, to African members when they join, is first of all to maintain efficient and safe operations. It's a key issue, as you know. But secondly, to push for reducing costs, and we help them to reduce costs everywhere in Africa. The cost of operation is too high. Whether it's cost of fuel, the cost of airport charges, taxes, or whatever. We also push governments to effectively implement what they have signed. The SATAM Treaty is a perfect example. We have a lot of signatories, but no implementation.
At the back of the room, I think David.
Hi, thanks. David Fogarty from the Straits Times in Singapore. Two questions. I noticed in the regional sort of animal breakdown doesn't include Southeast Asia, which is, as you know, is a very large area, 600 plus million people and growing quickly. So I wonder if you have any figures on how that region is going to grow. Is it going to become one of the major, outside of China, one of the major growth areas for the region? And if there's any impediments, I know there's been a lot of airports built, particularly in Indonesia. So if you can explain perhaps the positives and negatives in terms of that, what's allowing and or holding back the growth in Southeast Asia. And just a second question to follow up from my colleague of the South China Morning Post. Given there's going to be a lot of growth in aviation in Asia, what plans does IATA have to really push airlines to educate the flying public about carbon emissions, offsetting? I don't think it's just good enough really just to shrug it off and just say that's sort of people's attitudes. And Corsair, so if I understand it correctly, is still voluntary for a number of years to come. Thanks.
Okay, again, if I can take the first question. So ASEAN, Southeast Asia is included within our Asia-Pacific region. I think you're right to say that it's a really interesting, exciting region. It does contain some of the markets we think are going to be the fastest and biggest markets, particularly Indonesia, but also markets like Vietnam and the Philippines are up there as the fastest growing and emerging markets for air travel and also for cargo. Remember that a lot of the supply chains in Asia have assembly plants and production facilities in those economies, so it's really important for the air cargo business as well. What's holding it back? I think a dominant theme throughout the region is infrastructure, both on the ground and in the air, and certainly that's something that occupies IATA a lot, to get the right infrastructure, the right capacity built in the right places to support those connections that are driving development.
So in Southeast Asia, we'll continue first of all to promote some mechanisms to reduce our carbon footprint, to introduce some of information, communication, perhaps education is a big word, but information and communication elements in the frequent flyer program or in the in-flight entertainment systems, as Qantas is doing in his frequent flyer program. And of course, we'll continue to propose compensation mechanism, and it will be extended to Southeast Asian carriers. And of course, continue to work to reduce our carbon footprint. So it's not only educating the passenger, but sharing with them what we are doing, and to propose some compensation mechanism or information elements to for them to be properly informed, at least. I don't educated, I don't know, but informed.
Welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, I think the microphone.
It's right in front of you.
Oh, I see.
You just press the button.
I'm sure. Maybe this is the button. I've solved the mystery, sorry. Malcolm Ginsberg, Business Travel News, London. IATA, this is to you, Alexandre. IATA, you represent 80% of airlines. You're not going to tell me regarding an update on your relationship with non-IATA carriers, nor your expectation of joining, but I know you cooperate with some of them. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And maybe that way we can find out who might join.
As you know, we have something between 10 to 15% of our members who are what we call new model airlines and basically low cost airlines. We have had some new members joining the association. Big low cost, Indigo, the first one. The other one is SpiceJet or the Korean, one of the Korean low cost. So they represent something like around 15% of our membership. First of all, we are still working, with the big actors in that area, everywhere in the world, in Asia, in Europe, and in the US, for them to join. They are more than welcome, and so we have developed a kind of, how could I say that, platform of service that they can use or that could be attractive, seen from them, and for the moment it's pretty successful. Among the 20 new members we have had in 2019, almost more than half of them were new models or low cost airlines. So, but I have to recognize that the big guys are not members, but they will regret that in the future, and we are still chasing them.
It is past 10:30, so the embargo is officially over. Everything's available for reporting. I will note one thing in the press release. There's one thing I'd like to just draw your attention to. In terms of the average profit per departing passenger in 2020, it was $6.20, but it's incorrectly written as $5.42 for 2019. The correct figure is $5.70 per departing passenger in 2019. We'll take a question at the back of the room.
Ashraf Al-Hanini from Ahram newspaper, Egypt. My question to Mr. Juniac, you mentioned that there are some forces in the world today that are working against the freedom. Can you explain more about this point? And secondly, what is the main challenges which meet airlines in MENA in 2020?
There are several forces that are trying to increase obstacles on borders, or to develop obstacles on borders for passenger travel and trade. You have protectionists everywhere. You have not only in North America or in Asia, you have also protectionist measures that are taken even in Europe. You have many nationalistic politicians who are developing, closed border rhetoric everywhere in the world, but particularly in Europe. You have conflict zone or low intensity conflicts or wars in many parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, that are difficult for travel and trade, and especially for airlines. It's true for Qatar. The blockade for Qatar is not a good news for aviation. So there are several forces that are unfortunately pushing in favor of having more locked borders to people and trade, and we will fight against that permanently.
Thank you. I'll take a question here.
For the Gulf Times in Qatar, my name is Pratap John. Regarding the Middle East, in your outlook you said the region is coming out of weak economic growth in 2019, and in your outlook you expect some rebound in the region in 2020, mainly on stronger growth and restructuring. But what sort of restructuring do you anticipate in the region, especially the GCC? Thank you.
Well, let me briefly talk about that. I mean, as you know, we don't talk about individual airlines, but what we have seen is in the Gulf region, airlines look particularly closely at their business models, partly because the business environment deteriorated, and what previously had been very rapid expansion of capacity has been transformed. So there's been a much more careful approach to route development with a different fleet structure, and also, broader business models have been reassessed as well. So we see, we do see a much more cautious, considered approach to expanding business in the Gulf, and we've already seen significant improvements of load factors, which had dropped to very low levels. We've seen that improve. We've started to see that benefit in terms of better earnings as well.
Take a question from Jordan.
Hello, it's Jordan Chung from Australian Aviation. My question is to Mr. Pearce, and I'm just wondering if you could provide a little bit more colour or perspective on the outlook about labour in the year ahead. I think it talks here about labour costs were now rising, and that's one of the reasons behind the squeeze on margins. Just if you could just talk a little bit about some of the factors regarding that, whether it's scarcity of labour or whether it's other factors, and perhaps a bit of perspective on how regionally the labour situation, how different the labour situation is among the different regions, please. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let me comment on certainly the general situation. I think that, as we know, airlines have been facing challenges. We've seen pay disputes, we've seen strikes at a number of airlines. Clearly, labour relations have been an issue for many airlines in the last couple of years. And I think that reflects, firstly reflects the broader situation. Unemployment in major economies is at the lowest level ever. Labour markets are really tight. That means that workforces, particularly unionised workforces, have quite a bit of market power. So that's one factor, and that's true for the airline industry as well, which is facing its own issues of specific shortages, particularly of pilots and skilled engineers as well. So it's the fact that we've had 10, 11 years of expansion, which has really tightened up labour markets more generally and in aviation, which has given more influence to the workforce. And I think also the workforce have been looking back at profits airlines earned in past years. But of course, as we know, that shrunk quite substantially. I think that would continue to be an issue until we get a recession, which we're not expecting in the foreseeable future.
Question in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Hans Morris from Swiss Sunday paper Sonntagszeitung. I have a question towards the balance sheet improvements. You talk about the top 30 companies and then the rest of the industry. So how many are we talking about? And could you elaborate a bit more about those barely breaking even, as you mentioned on page 8, respectively having significant losses? And last part, please, how many airlines actually went bankrupt in the last 2 years? Thank you.
Yeah, we don't have I don't have a number here of the number of airlines that have gone bankrupt. But it is a significant number, and we've seen some significantly sized players in trouble. So just in terms of your balance sheet question, which is actually not this slide, I think it's the next slide. That's the one. So yeah, I mean, if you look at the top 30 airlines, which are not just the big airlines, there are some small airlines in here as well, and actually they're spread across the world. So it's not concentrated just in a few markets, but they've managed to generate enough cash flows, enough free cash flows, to be able to pay down some of the debt. Because if you look, they started the situation actually they were in a worse case after the global financial crisis than the industry average, but the cash flow they generated allowed them to pay down that debt. The rest of the industry consists of the ones we are able to measure consists of several hundred airlines. So that is the bulk of the industry in terms of numbers. The top 30 though don't have the numbers exactly, but they do generate a substantial proportion of business. They are larger airlines. And I think it reflects the fact that it's a very fragmented industry still. You have seen a more rational structures and consolidation in some of the markets in North America and in Western Europe, but not in many other parts of the world. At the moment, we're expecting the environment to be relatively benign in 2020, so maybe that won't be a problem, but it's clearly something we need to address as an industry in the future.
So could I just follow up? If you say several hundred, that means about, then the top 30, about 10%, which is roughly, or just approximately, please?
In terms of numbers, yes. But in terms of the size of the number of passengers carried, they will represent a much larger proportion.
Question for the second row? Yes, mic's in front of you.
Sally Gethin of In-Flight News.